Chosen one, for a long time it looked like the system was winning. The paperwork kept piling up. The rumors kept spreading. The delays kept stretching longer than anyone thought possible. Every time you expected resolution, another obstacle appeared. Every time you expected clarity, another complication emerged. And if you're honest, there were moments when you wondered whether justice would ever arrive at all. Because from your perspective, it seemed as if the people working against you had all the advantages. They had influence. They had connections. They had louder voices. They had access to systems designed to wear people down through exhaustion rather than confrontation. And that was the plan. They believed the process itself would defeat you. They thought the delays would drain your energy. They thought the pressure would make you quit. They thought you would eventually become so discouraged, so frustrated, and so exhausted that you would abandon the fight before the truth ever had a chance to surface. But they misunderstood something fundamental. They believed they were operating in an earthly courtroom. They had no idea a higher court was watching. They thought the paperwork, the rumors, and the delays would exhaust you into quitting. They thought you wouldn't make it to the finish line to tell your side of the story. But heaven wasn't delaying justice to mock you. Heaven was delaying so the enemy could provide enough evidence for their own spiritual prosecution. That is the perspective shift many chosen ones are beginning to understand. What looked like endless delays were not necessarily denials. What looked like setbacks were not necessarily defeats. What looked like silence was not necessarily abandonment. Because in the divine courtroom, timing works differently. Truth is not rushed. Evidence is not incomplete. And judgment is not based on appearances. While you were worrying about why nothing seemed to be happening, a larger process was unfolding behind the scenes. A process that required every action, every lie, every manipulation, and every abuse of power to fully reveal itself. Because before the verdict could be delivered, the case had to be complete. One of the most painful experiences for a chosen one is realizing that the attack did not come directly. It came through the system. Because people who cannot defeat you honestly often try to hide behind structures, procedures, titles, and institutions. They understand that direct confrontation exposes motives. But when pressure comes through official channels, community influence, bureaucracy, or public opinion, it becomes much harder to identify where the attack is truly coming from. That is why many chosen ones initially feel confused. The pressure seems impersonal. The obstacles seem random. The resistance appears to come from everywhere at once. But beneath the surface, there is often a coordinated effort to accomplish one thing. Exhaustion. Read that again. Exhaustion. The goal was not always to defeat you outright. Sometimes the goal was simply to make the process so frustrating, so complicated, and so emotionally draining that you would eventually give up on your own. That is why the paperwork never seemed to end. That is why every solution created another delay. That is why every step forward appeared to trigger another obstacle. The strategy relied on attrition. Not truth. Not fairness. Attrition. Because manipulators understand that many people will abandon their path if enough resistance is placed in front of them. They assume persistence has limits. They assume pressure eventually breaks everyone. They assume that if they can create enough confusion, enough bureaucracy, enough social pressure, or enough institutional resistance, the chosen one will simply disappear. But they made a critical mistake. They underestimated the assignment attached to your life. Because what they viewed as an inconvenience was actually preparation. What they viewed as a process was actually a test of endurance. What they viewed as a delay tactic was unknowingly strengthening the very person they were trying to weaken. And while they were focused on building barriers, something else was happening. Their methods were becoming visible. Every unnecessary obstacle revealed intent. Every abuse of influence revealed character. Every misuse of authority revealed motive. At first, these details seemed isolated. Small incidents, minor frustrations, individual moments that appeared disconnected from one another. But over time, a pattern emerged. And patterns are powerful. Because a single incident can be explained away. A repeated pattern becomes evidence. That is what many chosen ones fail to recognize while they are in the middle of the battle. They are so focused on surviving the next obstacle that they cannot yet see the larger picture forming around them. Meanwhile, the people weaponizing the system continue exposing themselves. They become overconfident. They become careless. They assume nobody is paying attention. They assume the process itself will hide their behavior. But every delay creates a record. Every action creates a trail. Every decision leaves evidence. And what they believed was a strategy for silencing you slowly becomes documentation of their own conduct. That is the irony. The very structures they attempted to use against you started recording their behavior. The very process designed to wear you down started preserving evidence. The very pressure they applied became part of a much larger story than they ever intended to tell. And in the Divine Courtroom, stories matter less than patterns, because patterns reveal intention. And intention is becoming harder for them to hide with every passing day. This is the part of the story most chosen ones misunderstand while they are living through it. The delay. Because when you are standing in the middle of a battle, delays feel unfair. They feel frustrating. They feel unnecessary. Every extra week feels heavy. Every extra month feels exhausting. Every postponed resolution feels like another reason to question whether justice is ever going to arrive. And that is exactly why so many people misinterpret what is happening. They assume delay means defeat. They assume delay means abandonment. They assume delay means the enemy is winning. But what if the delay was serving two purposes at the same time? What if heaven was not only protecting you? What if heaven was also exposing them? Read that again. What if heaven was not only protecting you? What if heaven was also exposing them? Because while you were focused on how long the process was taking, something important was happening behind the scenes. You were healing. The chosen one who entered the battle is not the same person standing here today. Back then, you were carrying more anger, more confusion, more emotional weight, more unanswered questions. The attack had wounded you. The betrayal had shaken you. The pressure had taken a toll. And if the verdict had arrived too early, you might have received justice while still carrying the scars of the battle. But heaven wanted something greater. Not just your victory, your restoration. That is why time became part of the process. While you were waiting, your mind was clearing. Your emotions were stabilizing. Your discernment was deepening. Your identity was strengthening. The wounds that once controlled your perspective began losing their power. You were becoming stronger. Meanwhile, something very different was happening on the other side. The people working against you kept talking, kept acting, kept manipulating, kept creating new problems, kept making decisions based on arrogance rather than wisdom. And every time they acted, they added another piece to the record. That is the mistake pride always makes. Pride mistakes delay for permission. Because when consequences do not arrive immediately, people often assume they are safe. They assume nobody sees. They assume they got away with it. They assume the absence of immediate accountability means the behavior is acceptable. So they continue, and continue, and continue, until the pattern becomes undeniable. That is why the delay was so important. Without time, the pattern would not have fully revealed itself. Without time, the evidence would have been incomplete. Without time, certain truths would have remained hidden beneath excuses, explanations, and carefully crafted appearances. But time removes masks. Time reveals motives. Time exposes patterns. And while you were using the delay to heal, they were using the delay to incriminate themselves. That is the divine interruption. The process stopped being about what they were doing to you. It became about what they were revealing about themselves. And now, as the pieces come together, many chosen ones are beginning to understand something that once felt impossible to accept. The delay was never working against them. It was working for them. Because by the time the verdict arrives, you will not only be vindicated, you will be whole. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence in this entire case is not a document, a witness, or a record. It is you. More specifically, who you became while the battle was taking place. Because many of the attacks against chosen ones rely on a very specific narrative. The goal is not simply to create problems. The goal is to create a perception. They want people to believe you are unstable. They want people to believe you are emotional, irrational, difficult, or somehow responsible for the chaos surrounding you. That is why provoking a reaction was always part of the strategy. If they could make you explode, they could point to the explosion as proof. If they could keep you angry, they could point to the anger as proof. If they could trap you in bitterness, they could point to the bitterness as proof. The accusation did not require truth. It required a reaction. That is what makes your healing so devastating to their narrative. Because after everything you endured, they expected damage. Instead, they found growth. Read that again. They expected damage. Instead, they found growth. The chosen one standing here today is calmer than before, more disciplined than before, more emotionally regulated than before, more focused than before. The very battle that was supposed to destroy your credibility ended up strengthening your character. And that creates a serious problem for anyone trying to maintain a false narrative. Because eventually people stop listening to accusations and start observing outcomes. They look at your life. They look at your energy. They look at your peace. They look at your ability to move forward without becoming consumed by hatred. And they start asking questions. If this person was truly what we were told, why do they seem so grounded? If they were truly unstable, why do they seem so clear? If they were truly guilty, why do they carry themselves with such confidence and peace? The questions become difficult to ignore, because healing creates evidence. Not loud evidence, powerful evidence. Your healed mind becomes proof that the attack failed. Your emotional control becomes proof that the manipulation failed. Your ability to keep moving forward becomes proof that the strategy failed. And perhaps most importantly, your lack of bitterness becomes proof that your spirit remained intact. That last part matters more than most people realize, because many victories are incomplete. A person wins externally but loses internally. They achieve vindication but remain trapped in resentment. They escape the situation but continue carrying the emotional weight of it everywhere they go. That is not what happened here. You healed. You released. You grew. And by doing so, you removed the strongest argument your enemies thought they had. They wanted a broken version of you standing at the finish line. Instead, they found someone stronger, someone wiser, someone more aligned, someone who no longer needed revenge because they had already reclaimed their peace. That is why your healed mind is such powerful evidence in the Divine Courtroom, because it demonstrates something no accusation can erase. The attack may have delayed you, but it did not define you. And in the end, that truth speaks louder than any story they ever tried to tell. There comes a moment in every story like this when the bill arrives. Not the bill they expected, the bill they created. Because throughout this entire process, many of your enemies operated as if consequences could be negotiated. They believed influence could replace integrity. They believed pressure could replace truth. They believed manipulation could permanently alter an outcome that was never theirs to control. For a while, it may have looked like they were succeeding, but appearances can be deceptive, because every action creates a debt. Every lie creates a debt. Every abuse of authority creates a debt. Every attempt to harm an innocent person creates a debt. And eventually, the invoice arrives. Read that again. Eventually, the invoice arrives. This is what many people call karma. In the language of this message, it is spiritual accounting. The universe keeps records that human systems often overlook. Motives matter. Intentions matter. Character matters. And when someone repeatedly violates those principles, they create liabilities that cannot remain hidden forever. That is the spiritual bankruptcy many of your enemies are beginning to face. Not because you cursed them. Not because you sought revenge. Not because you spent your energy trying to make something happen. Because actions carry consequences. The same arrogance that convinced them they were untouchable becomes their weakness. The same manipulation they used against others starts damaging their own credibility. The same shortcuts they trusted begin collapsing beneath them. And perhaps the hardest part for them is this. They cannot blame you. You stayed focused on healing. You stayed focused on growth. You stayed focused on your own path. Meanwhile, they continued adding charges to an account they assumed would never be collected. Now the balance is due. Not necessarily through dramatic punishment, through exposure, through consequences, through the natural outcome of choices repeated over time. Because universal law cannot be bribed, pressured, or manipulated. And when the invoice finally arrives, many discover that the trap they built for someone else quietly became a trap for themselves. Chosen one, the final stage of this process, is not just private vindication. It is public restoration. Because one of the deepest wounds caused by these battles was not simply what happened behind closed doors. It was the way people perceived it. It was the misunderstandings, the rumors, the distorted narratives, the questions that lingered in the minds of people who never had access to the full truth. That is why heaven's work does not stop at protecting you. It also restores what was damaged. Read that again. It also restores what was damaged. For a long time, it may have felt like the people spreading the narrative were winning. Their version of events seemed louder. Their influence seemed stronger. Their story appeared to travel further than the truth. But truth has something lies do not. Endurance. A lie needs constant maintenance. It needs protection. It needs new explanations. It needs people willing to keep repeating it. Truth simply waits. And eventually, people begin noticing the difference. They notice the inconsistencies. They notice the contradictions. They notice who remained focused on growth and who remained obsessed with the past. They notice who carried peace and who carried bitterness. They notice who kept building and who kept attacking. And little by little, perception begins changing. Not because you forced it, because reality became impossible to ignore. The same community that once questioned you starts reevaluating what they believed. The same people who accepted certain stories begin seeing new evidence. The same observers who remained silent begin recognizing that they were never given the complete picture. That is when the reversal begins. Your name is restored. Your character is recognized. Your integrity becomes visible. And perhaps most importantly, it happens without you having to fight for it. Because the strongest restoration is the one built on truth rather than self-promotion. The strongest vindication is the one that arrives naturally. And as this public reversal unfolds, many chosen ones will finally understand something they struggled to believe during the darkest part of the battle. The truth did not need saving. It only needed time. So remember this, chosen one. The gavel has already fallen. The verdict was never determined by rumors, delays, paperwork, or the opinions of people who only saw part of the story. It was determined by truth. You survived the process. You protected your peace. You arrived at the finish line stronger, wiser, and more aligned than when the battle began. If this message spoke to your spirit, like this video, subscribe to the channel and share it with another chosen one who needs this reminder today. And in the comments type, the verdict is already written, because what was meant to trap you became the evidence that set you free.